There's a question that has haunted political analysts for over a decade. How is Nicolás Maduro still in power? He inherited a collapsing economy. He faced the largest protests in Venezuelan history. The opposition won democratic elections. The international community refused to recognize him. His own military brass plotted against him. Millions of his citizens fled. Every expert said he'd fall. Every model predicted his regime would crumble. Every historical parallel suggested he couldn't survive. But he did. And the answer to how he did it doesn't start in 2013 when he became president. It doesn't even start with Hugo Chávez. It starts in 1986 in a classroom in Havana, Cuba, where a young bus driver from Caracas was being taught something very specific, something that would make him decades later virtually impossible to remove. January 1986. Nicolás Maduro Moros was 23 years old. He'd been driving buses for the Caracas Metro for 3 years. His hands were rough from gripping the steering wheel 10 hours a day. His paycheck barely covered rent in El Valle, one of the capital's poorest neighborhoods. But Maduro had something most bus drivers didn't have. He had connections. Through his father, a union leader in the radical leftist party MEP, young Nicolás had been recruited into Liga Socialista, one of Venezuela's most committed Marxist-Leninist organizations. And Liga Socialista had friends in Havana. Very powerful friends. That January, Maduro received an invitation that would change his life. The Cuban government was offering select Latin American activists a year-long program at the Escuela de Formación Política, a political training academy run by Cuba's Communist Party. This wasn't a university. This wasn't an open enrollment course you could find in a catalog. This was an invitation-only school for future revolutionaries, a place where Cuban intelligence officers taught the art of political survival. Maduro arrived in Havana with almost nothing, and with no degree, no wealth, no charisma. What he had was loyalty, discipline, and a willingness to learn. The curriculum at the Escuela wasn't about Marx and Lenin alone, though theory was certainly part of it. The real lessons were tactical: how to organize cells within labor unions, how to identify and neutralize internal threats, how to build parallel power structures that could survive even if the formal government fell, how to use scarcity and dependency to control populations, how to manage military loyalty through corruption and complicity. Cuban instructors, many of them veterans of Angola's Civil War and Nicaragua's Sandinista Revolution, taught one core principle above all else. Survival beats ideology. You can have the purest revolutionary vision in the world, but if you can't hold power, it means nothing. For nearly a year, Maduro studied. He networked with other young revolutionaries from across Latin America. He built relationships with Cuban intelligence operatives who would remain his contacts for decades, and he learned patience. One of his instructors reportedly told the class, "A revolutionary who rushes to the spotlight dies young. A revolutionary who works in the shadows survives." Maduro took that lesson to heart. When he returned to Venezuela in late 1987, he didn't try to become a firebrand leader. He went back to driving buses, back to union meetings, back to the shadows. But now, he understood something most activists didn't. Power isn't seized in a single dramatic moment. It's accumulated quietly, methodically, over years. 1992. Venezuela was in crisis. The government of Carlos Andrés Pérez had imposed brutal neoliberal reforms. Riots swept the country. The military was restless, and on February 4th, a young lieutenant colonel named Hugo Chávez led a failed coup attempt. The coup failed, but Chavez became a folk hero. Maduro, now 29 and a rising figure in Caracas's union movement, recognized an opportunity. While Chavez was imprisoned, Maduro became one of the civilian activists campaigning for his release. He visited Chavez in Yare prison, brought him news from the outside, carried his messages to supporters, and crucially, he never tried to replace Chavez, never tried to grab the spotlight for himself. He was the loyal lieutenant, the dependable organizer, the man who made things happen without demanding credit. When Chavez was released from prison in 1994, he found Maduro waiting, not with grand speeches or political demands, just with quiet, effective work. Chavez decided to abandon the armed struggle and pursue electoral politics. He needed people he could trust, people who would execute orders without question, people who understood organization, not just rhetoric. Maduro was perfect. In 1998, when Chavez ran for president, Maduro was one of the founding members of the Fifth Republic Movement Party. He didn't run for office himself that year. He worked in the background, organizing barrio committees, coordinating logistics, making sure voters in Caracas's poorest neighborhoods got to the polls. Chavez won in a landslide, and Maduro's patience began to pay off. Over the next 14 years, Maduro climbed steadily through Chavez's government. He never rushed, never made himself threatening to Chavez or to the powerful generals who surrounded him. In 1999, he was elected to the Constituent Assembly that wrote Venezuela's new Bolivarian constitution. He learned the legal architecture of the new state. In 2000, he became a congressman. In 2005, he was elected president of the National Assembly, where he loyally passed every law Chavez wanted, no matter how radical. And in 2006, Chavez gave him the job that would define his future: foreign minister. As foreign minister from 2006 to 2012, Maduro became the architect of Venezuela's anti-American alliances. He traveled constantly: Moscow, Beijing, Tehran, Managua. He negotiated oil for loans deals with China that would eventually give Beijing control over much of Venezuela's future production. He signed arms deals with Russia worth billions. He built relationships with Iran's Revolutionary Guard. He expanded ALBA, the socialist trade bloc that used Venezuelan oil money to buy political loyalty across Latin America. Chavez was the charismatic face of the Bolivarian Revolution, but Maduro was the one building the international scaffolding that would keep it alive even after Chavez was gone, and that scaffolding would prove critical. 2011, Hugo Chávez was diagnosed with cancer. The revolutionary giant, the man who seemed invincible, was dying. Suddenly, the question everyone in Venezuela was asking became urgent. Who would succeed him? There were obvious candidates: Diosdado Cabello, a powerful general and party boss who controlled much of the military and had his own network of loyalists; Elias Jawa, an intellectual and ideologue; Jorge Arreaza, Chavez's son-in-law, educated and articulate. But Chavez chose none of them. On December 8, 2012, visibly weakened, Chavez appeared on television to address the nation. He said he needed another surgery in Cuba, and then he said something that shocked Venezuela's political elite. "My firm opinion, as clear as the full moon, is that you elect Nicolás Maduro as president." Why Maduro? Political insiders offered theories. Maduro was civilian, which meant he didn't threaten the military power structure the way another general might. He was seen as manageable, someone the generals and Cabello's faction could control. And crucially, Havana wanted Maduro. Cuban intelligence had maintained close contact with him since his training in the 80s. They trusted him. They knew he understood how to survive. Chavez, who relied heavily on Cuban advisors, followed their recommendation. On March 5, 2013, Hugo Chávez died. Maduro, constitutionally required to call elections within 30 days, became interim president, April 14, 2013. The way presidential election, Maduro faced Enrique Capriles, the opposition candidate who'd lost to Chavez by 11 points just 6 months earlier. Everyone expected Maduro to win comfortably on the wave of sympathy for Chavez. But when the results came in, Maduro had won by only 1.5%, less than 200,000 votes out of nearly 15 million cast. The opposition immediately cried fraud. International observers found irregularities. Capriles demanded a recount. Protests erupted, and for the first time, Maduro faced the question that would define his presidency. How do you hold power when you barely won it? This was the moment when everything Maduro had learned in Havana came into play. A charismatic leader might have tried to win hearts and minds, might have reached out to the opposition, formed a unity government, eased tensions. Maduro did the opposite. He doubled down. He refused the recount. He used state media to paint the opposition as coup plotters and American agents. He mobilized armed pro-government militias called colectivos to intimidate protesters in the streets. And, most importantly, he made a deal with the military, specifically with Diosdado Cabello. Cabello was more powerful than Maduro in many ways. He controlled the party machinery. He had deep ties to the armed forces, but Cabello also had a problem. He wanted power, but he knew that if he took it directly, he'd face immediate pushback from Cuba, from parts of the military loyal to Chavez's legacy, and from the international community. So Maduro and Cabello made an arrangement. Maduro would be the public face, the president. But Cabello would control key institutions, especially the military and internal security. They would share power. More accurately, Maduro would hold the title while Cabello held much of the real authority. This arrangement created a regime that was almost impossible to overthrow because it had no single point of failure. If you wanted to remove Maduro, you'd have to remove Cabello too. And Cabello had his own power base. If you tried to stage a military coup, you'd face divisions within the armed forces between Cabello's loyalists and other factions. The regime became a hydra, cut off one head, and others remained. And then came the economic collapse. 2014, global oil prices crashed. Venezuela's economy, which depended on oil for 96% of export revenue, went into freefall. Maduro's government responded by printing money to cover budget deficits. Inflation exploded. By 2018, Venezuela had the highest inflation rate in the world, over 1,000,000% according to the IMF. Supermarket shelves emptied. Medicine disappeared. Electricity became unreliable. Water supplies failed in major cities. Venezuelans began losing weight from malnutrition, an average of 11 kilograms per person, according to studies. The media called it the Maduro diet. It wasn't a joke. People were starving. In 2015, the opposition won control of the National Assembly in a landslide. For most governments, this would be a crisis. For Maduro, it was an opportunity to demonstrate another lesson from Havana. When democratic institutions threaten your power, bypass them. Maduro had the Supreme Court, which he controlled, declare most of the Assembly's actions unconstitutional. Then in 2017, he simply created a new legislative body, the Constituent Assembly, packed entirely with government loyalists. Venezuela now had two parliaments, the one voters had elected, which had no power, and the one Maduro had created, which had all the power. 2017 became the year of mass protests. Hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans took to the streets demanding Maduro's resignation. The protests lasted for months. Over 120 people died, most shot by security forces or armed colectivos. International media predicted this was the end. Surely Maduro couldn't survive this level of popular rejection, but he did. And the way he did it revealed the full sophistication of the survival system he'd built. First, he made sure the security forces stayed loyal, not through ideology, but through corruption. Senior military officers were given control of lucrative businesses, food importation, gold mining, even cocaine trafficking. U.S. prosecutors would later allege that Venezuela had become a narco-state, with military generals operating what they called the Cartel of the Suns, named after the sun insignia on their uniforms. In 2015, the DEA arrested two nephews of Maduro's wife, Celia Flores. They were caught in Haiti trying to fly 800 kilograms of cocaine into the United States. During their trial in New York, the nephews testified that the operation had support from the highest levels of the Venezuelan government. The regime denied everything, but the message to military insiders was clear. We're all complicit now. If the regime falls, we all fall. Loyalty became self-preservation. Second, Maduro weaponized hunger. In 2016, the government launched the CLAP program, local supply committees that delivered subsidized food boxes directly to homes. On the surface, a humanitarian response to shortages. In reality, a political control mechanism. CLAP boxes went preferentially to government supporters. To get one, you often needed a carnet de la patria, a government-issued identification card that tracked your political activity. The implicit message was clear. Loyalty to the regime meant food. Opposition meant hunger. Investigative journalists later revealed that the CLAP program was also a massive corruption scheme. A businessman named Alex Saab imported low-quality food at inflated prices, skimming hundreds of millions of dollars, much of which allegedly flowed back to regime insiders. Third, Maduro divided the opposition. He negotiated with some factions while jailing leaders of others. He allowed some opposition parties to participate in elections while banning others. He created the appearance of democratic process while ensuring he couldn't lose. When the opposition boycotted elections in protest, he pointed to low turnout as proof they had no support. When they participated and won, he declared the results illegitimate. The opposition fractured between those who wanted to negotiate and those who wanted to boycott, between those who trusted international mediation and those who called for regime change. Maduro didn't have to defeat them. He just had to keep them fighting among themselves. And fourth, he locked in international support, not from the West, which increasingly sanctioned Venezuela and refused to recognize his government, but from the powers that mattered for survival. Russia provided military equipment and political cover at the UN. China continued offering loans in exchange for future oil shipments, giving Maduro access to cash when Western banks had cut him off. Cuba sent thousands of intelligence operatives and military advisors who helped Maduro monitor and neutralize internal threats. Iran shared tactics for evading sanctions and maintaining oil exports through covert networks. Turkey became a gold laundering hub, buying Venezuelan gold and providing hard currency. These relationships weren't based on ideology. They were based on mutual benefit. Maduro gave these countries access to Venezuela's natural resources and a foothold in Latin America. They gave him the tools to survive. By 2019, the situation looked impossible for Maduro. The U.S. and over 50 countries recognized opposition leader Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's legitimate president. Sanctions were crushing what remained of the economy. Mass protests filled the streets again. Even some military officers publicly defected, but Maduro held on. When Guaidó called for a military uprising, only a handful of soldiers joined him. The rest stayed loyal, or at least stayed quiet, because Maduro and Cabello had spent years ensuring that anyone with the power to remove them was also too compromised to risk the regime's fall. There's a moment that encapsulates Maduro's survival strategy perfectly. In 2018, during a military parade, someone allegedly flew drones carrying explosives toward the stage where Maduro was speaking. The president flinched. Soldiers scattered. But Maduro wasn't hurt. Later analysis suggested the attack might have been staged or at least exaggerated. But, real or not, Maduro used it brilliantly. He purged military officers he didn't trust, claiming they were connected to the plot. He arrested opponents, blaming them for the attack. And he tightened his inner circle even further. Threat became opportunity. Today, 13 years after that disputed 2013 election, Nicolás Maduro still controls Venezuela. The country he governs is a shadow of what it was. 7 million people, nearly a quarter of the population, have fled. The economy has shrunk by 75%. Poverty affects over 90% of the population. Venezuela, which should be wealthy from its oil, has become one of the Western Hemisphere's poorest nations. But Maduro remains, not because he's beloved, not because he's legitimate in the eyes of most Venezuelans or the international community, but because he's built a system where removing him is nearly impossible without destroying the entire power structure. The question political analysts ask, how is he still in power, has an answer. Maduro survives because he never tried to be Chavez. Chavez needed love. Maduro only needs compliance. Chavez relied on charisma and oil wealth. Maduro relies on fear, complicity, and international backing from powers that don't care about democracy. Chavez wanted to be a revolutionary icon. Maduro just wants to survive. And survival, as his Cuban instructors taught him back in 1986, is the only thing that matters. What makes Maduro's story so chilling isn't that he's a monster, it's that he's not. He's not a military genius. He's not a brilliant strategist. He's not even particularly charismatic. He's just patient, disciplined, and willing to do whatever it takes. That year in Havana didn't teach him how to inspire people. It taught him how to outlast them. It taught him that if you control the food, the guns, and the information, you don't need to be loved. You just need to make yourself impossible to remove without catastrophic cost. The former bus driver who everyone dismissed as a placeholder, who barely won his first election, who inherited a collapsing economy and faced overwhelming opposition, is still there. Not because he's strong, but because he made himself unremovable. And that's a far more dangerous kind of power. If this story revealed something you didn't know about how modern authoritarianism actually works, hit that subscribe button. Share this with someone who still believes dictators hold power through force alone. Drop a comment about what surprised you most about Maduro's survival. And turn on notifications, because We're diving deeper into the untold stories of how power really works in the shadows. This is Maduro, the untold story.